So here we go. We're still in Illinois, the first leg of our trip, and we're on stop number 4 of 5. So next week we'll finish that first little leg and get ready to head into Missouri. And today we're stopping in Litchfield, is our Route 66 stop here. And Litchfield is known for a couple of things. One is it has a real famous restaurant called the Ariston Cafe, and this it's famous because they started serving food the year that Route 66 opened, so like 1926, and they've been continuing serving ever since. So if we were going down old Route 66 and this sits right on it, we'd stop there. They also have what's called the Route 66 Welcome Center, and that's this building. It kind of looks like Noah's Ark a little bit, doesn't it? I don't know what's in there, but you know, it's right on old Route 66, and we'd stop there. And then it has the Skyview Drive-In, which is the only drive-in in the state of Illinois that still is functional and shows movies. And if you watched our little clip this week that Biff and I do you remember what movie is showing right now at the Skyview? Sully. All right. So 3 people watched that, Biff. This is good. You know, we're making progress because it was like 2 last week. So anyway, so our corresponding book out of the Old Testament as we move along is the book of Numbers. And Numbers is literally the title of the Hebrew book. And I haven't gotten into this before, but your titles in your Bible, generally speaking, are the titles that were given to these books when it was translated into Greek out of the Hebrew. In the Hebrew Bible, most of the books that were titled by a phrase that would come out of the very first verse of the book. And so if you look at the first verse of the book of Numbers, it talks about God speaking to Moses in the wilderness, and that was the title of the book in the Hebrew text. The name Numbers, by the way, comes from the Greek arithmoi, which means numbers. That's why we translate it like that. But we obviously get our word arithmetic from it, and one of the reasons it's named that way is because it's a book that starts with a census, a numbering of the nation of Israel, and it ends with a census. And in between, most of the time is spent wandering around out in the wilderness, and this morning we're going to see why that was. Generally speaking, just to summarize it, it's a book that tells the story of the Israelites and their journey when they leave Mount Sinai, and from their travel, the intention was to travel into the Promised Land. That doesn't quite happen, as many of you know. But so the book takes us, though, from when they leave Sinai and ultimately ends with the nation of Israel on the east bank of the Jordan River across from Jericho, getting ready to enter into the land. And that sort of is the big idea behind the book of Numbers. It's a book with all kinds of detail in it if you've tried to read it this week. And it's a good book. It's got some really important stuff in it. I'm going to try and hit the highlights this morning. The book breaks down into kind of 4 big parts, and if you can remember this, you can remember a lot of what the book is all about. And those 4 parts are again the final preparation for the nation leaving Mount Sinai, then the journey from Sinai to a place out in the desert called Kadesh Barnea, and from there wandering around in the wilderness for 38 years, and finally the book, the 4th part of it, is when they arrive again on the east bank of the Jordan River. And so I'm going to try and just walk you through these quickly this morning. The final preparations for the journey include 3 instructions that God gives them early in the book of Numbers. And the first one is real simple. He tells them to take a census. And so the book begins this way. The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai on the first day of the 2nd month of the 2nd year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. And he said, take a census of the whole Israelite community by their clans and families, listing every man by name, one by one. You and Aaron are to count, according to their divisions, all the men in Israel who are 20 years old or more and able to serve in the army. And so early in the book, you'll see how people are picked from each of the tribes to be part of this census has taken place, and then you're told exactly how many people, as they count how many men there are 20 years and older in each of the tribes, and then at the end we're given a figure. And, we're given a figure. I've got the wrong slide. I was just going to tell you, we're still at Sinai. That's what this was for. But when we get then to the end of this census, we're told that the number of men 20 years of age and older is 603,550. Part of the significance of that is that this is the number that helps us know how many people came out of Egypt and what the size of the nation of Israel, how the Israelites, what size they had grown to. And roughly speaking, if there were 600,000 men over the age of 20, and they, in their world, would have all been married by that time, and they would have had roughly something like 2.5 kids per family. What we do is we can take that and then we kind of project it out, and that extrapolates to give us this figure of roughly 3 million people that have come out of Egypt. And so the census tells us something about that. The second instruction that God gives Moses is he tells them to organize the encampment. And so again, in chapter 2, we're told this. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "The Israelites are to camp around the tent of meeting, some distance from it, each of them under their standard and holding the banners of their family." And so at this point in time, and this is going to be true every time that they leave a spot and move somewhere else and settle down in camp, they're going to be organized, and everything's going to be organized, and they're all going to dwell with, right at the center will be the tabernacle there in the wilderness, and it would look something like this. We know from just the way that the description is given, and so you've got the 12 tribes. There in the center, by the way, right around the tabernacle, those three smaller little groupings would be the tribe of Levi, because they were the ones that did the work and the service there at the tabernacle, and they actually protected it. And on the east side, right in front of the tabernacle itself, the entrance into it, was where Moses and Aaron would camp out. So everywhere they went, you would have this kind of a formation, and so they're organized. And I would say that one of the things that kind of strikes me about this is simply this, that even in this organization, and the image you get there is you can see that this was a nation that where God was to be at the center of their existence. I mean, and physically this is true, simply in the way that they camp out as they move from site to site. But it's a great visual reminder that if they were going to fulfill their destiny, they really had to keep their relationship with God at the center of all things. So, took a census, organized the encampment. And then the third instruction that God gives them is that he tells them he wants them now to observe Passover. Earlier in Exodus and in Leviticus, they've been given instructions about how to observe Passover, but this will be the first time since they've left Egypt that they actually observe the Passover. And so this is found in the 9th chapter, where we're told the Lord spoke to Moses in the desert of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they came out of Egypt. And he said, "Have the Israelites celebrate the Passover at the appointed time. Celebrate it at twilight on the 14th day of this month in accordance with all its rules and regulations." By the way, just to give you a little sense of chronology, when they leave Egypt, it takes them 3 months to get to Sinai. So when we looked, for instance, at the book of Exodus when they arrived, and the 10 Commandments are given, and also more of the law and the instructions for the tabernacle, it's been a relatively short time since they've left Egypt. The tabernacle, when it is set up, we're told that it's set up on the first day of the first month of the second year. So in a sense, constructing the tabernacle has taken 9 months. And again, it was quite an artistic and beautiful structure that God instructed them to build. But from the time that they hit Sinai till the time then that actually from the time they leave Egypt, now we're roughly at about the 1 year mark. Okay, so it's been 1 year when we get to this point in the book, and then the census, we're told, is taken on the first day of the second month of the second year. So again, a month transpires from the time that they set up the tabernacle, and they head out on the 20th day of the second month of the second year. And so again, we have this little piece of time, and they're going to celebrate Passover before they leave, and I'm going to give you a spoiler, because then they do not celebrate Passover again for 38 years. And the reason is that this was not a festival to be celebrated in the wilderness. This was a festival that was to be celebrated in the Promised Land. And they don't observe it again until they cross the Jordan and enter. And what we're going to see when we get to the book of Joshua is one of the first things they do once they finally have entered the land is they celebrate the Passover. So all of that to kind of get prepared to leave. And then the second part of the book really is the leaving from Sinai and this journey up into the wilderness there, probably to this spot of Kadesh Barnea. We aren't specifically told that in the text when an event is coming that I'll tell you about, but we do know that when the event that's coming, and I'm going to tell you about that you don't know what it is quite yet, is over, that they come back to this place, and so we assume that's where they left from, and that's not really all that important, is it? Okay, so here's what happens. 20th day, second month of the second year, the cloud lifts. Now, this tangible manifestation of the presence of God, this cloud that has hovered over them and has led them through the wilderness to Mount Sinai, that cloud has been over the encampment now, again, for a year and a month, and they were told not to leave there until the cloud left, because this was the presence of God, and God was going to guide them along the way. And when the cloud moved, they moved, and when it came to a stop, that's where they camped, and they stayed there and camped there, sometimes only for a day, sometimes for months, and they would wait, because this was the way God was telling them it's time to move on. And so here in the second month of the second year, the cloud lifts and moves, and God begins to guide them. Now, as He guides them, it's really interesting, because the book itself has several themes that when you read it, they just keep occurring over and over and over again. And those themes are this, that the people are constantly complaining about something. Have you read the book? They're driving Moses crazy all the time, but they're always complaining, they're always, grumbling, and ultimately there's going to be wandering around complaining and grumbling. And the thing that's crazy about this is that the first time we're told about their complaining on this leg of the trip, they've been on the road 3 whole days, okay? So they're barely getting started, and they complain. They complain about 3 things to Moses. They complain, first of all, about the difficulty. And in chapter 11, and let me see, let me get a little bit of a map up here. So here's where we're heading, from Sinai, roughly up, to where you see the little star and the arrow pointing, which is again kind of out in the wilderness there and in the desert. And that's, anyway, I'll get into that in a minute. But But it hasn't been easy. I guess for 3 days it hasn't been easy. But they complain, and what they're always saying, by the way, when you read the book is, why did you take us out of Egypt? You take us out of here just to die in the desert, and we ought to go back to Egypt. And they're constantly, this theme just keeps recurring. And the other theme that recurs is every time they complain, God says, why don't I just get rid of all these people and start over again? And Moses intercedes. Moses is always saying, oh, don't do that because, and basically what Moses' argument is all of the other nations, they're going to hear about this and they're going to think that it failed. Your plans and purposes failed. But he intervenes and God, constantly gives them a little more grace so they can carry on. So they complain about difficulty. Second thing they complain about is food. They crave the food of Egypt. Now, back in Exodus, in chapter 16, you probably remember, we were introduced to the fact that as they were in the wilderness, God provided supernaturally for them food. And that food was called manna. And it's kind of a fun little expression for those of you that weren't with us because the question is asked when it was like a wafer-like substance that would be there in the morning, the dew would evaporate and they would have this, this wafer that they could then gather and it would sustain them in their time through the wilderness. And when they first look at it, they ask the question, what is it? And in Hebrew, that question is manhu. What is it? And the response is manna. It is what it is. That's kind of what manna means. But so now, here they are for a year, obviously, a little over a year, they've been eating manna, and they complain about it, and they grumble about it, and they ask for meat. They want meat. And even Moses says to God, there's no way in the world that we could supply meat for all of these people. And God kind of says, well, here, they want meat, I'm going to give them meat. And so he sends quail in, and we're told that the quail come, they die, that it's at the depth of 3 feet. I mean, it's a serious quail. And what God says, I'm going to give them so much meat that I'm going to give it to them till it comes out of their nostrils and they loathe it. All right, so this is a pretty picture, okay? Nothing, by the way, like, the brunch bunch and our little meals we have together. Okay, and God then, as they're eating, we're told while they're still eating it, God, he's angry about this, and we're told that a plague breaks out in the camp. And it's very fascinating because one of the verses I really like out of the book of Psalms is, I'm quite convinced that like the Israelites, I don't know what's going to be good for me and what's not going to be good for me. And in the book of Psalms, this can mean one of two things, but I like this translation. Oh, this was an alternative, by the way, if they didn't take the traditional route. Let me get here over to the book of, there we go. The book of Psalms, in one of the translations, it translates this way. He gave them what they craved, but sent leanness into their souls. The other way it can be translated is that he sent a wasting disease among them, which is probably more accurate, seeing what happens because a plague breaks out. But I can remember the first time I ran across this verse, and I thought, you know what? Lord, I know that I'm going to want things that they aren't going to be good for me. And would you please not give me anything that would put leanness into my soul? And so I've always liked this verse. So I thought I'd just share it with you this morning. And so they complain about food. God gives them meat. Plague breaks out, and then again Moses intervenes, and God, backs it off. And then the third thing in this early part of the journey that they complain about is they complain about the leadership. And we're going to have 2 real major events in the book of Numbers where the people complain about the leadership. In the early situation, chapter 12 of the book, it's it's Moses' brother Aaron and sister Miriam. And they kind of come to Moses and say, boy, you sure think you're a big deal, don't you? Kind of. I mean, they're like jealous of his leadership, and they're saying, you're no different than we are. We should have the same, kind of authority that you have. And God responds to that by striking Miriam with leprosy. And she sort of gets the message. She doesn't complain about it quite after that. And then Moses intervenes again, and God heals her. So these events are taking place. And again, they're all leading up to what I would say is the single most critical event in the book of Numbers. And that's this. The wandering. I'm going to give you the background to the wandering, which is the third part of the book too. So they get to this place in the wilderness, probably Kadesh Barnea, and God says this to Moses. So they're kind of on the border of the promised land at this point in time. And before they go in to take possession of the promised land, God says to Moses, send in men to spy out the land, explore it, and which I'm giving, and from each ancestral tribe send one of its leaders. And so men are picked from each of the 12 tribes, and we usually refer to them as the spies, but they're sent into the land that God has promised them. And they spend 40 days in the land checking it out. And when they come back out of checking it out, they give two different reports to the people. The first is what you might think of as the majority report. And here's how the majority report goes. I was just showing you where the spies go up there. Okay. I'm not doing great on my slides today. I'm a little off here. So they came back to Moses. Here's what the majority say. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. And there they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. We're told as they're coming out, by the way, they get a cluster of grapes. And the cluster of grapes is so large that it takes two men carrying like, a beam with the grapes hanging on it just to carry them. And so they show that, here's the fruit of the land. And they say to Moses, we went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey, and here is its fruit. And then they say this, but, and they go on and they give this report, but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large, and we even saw descendants of Anak there, which were giants. This is like when we get to Goliath, he was a descendant out of this line of giants. So, and so they give this report, and basically the cities are fortified. And let me see, I think I've got one more text in it. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they'd explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Now, basically, what the 10 spies have said is, it's exactly like God promised. It is a great place. It's flowing with milk and honey. Look at the produce, but the problem is we can't do it. In other words, we try to conquer this land and we're going to get our clocks cleaned, is what this majority reports. 10 of the spies, 10 of them give this report. But there's a minority report that's given by 2 of the spies. Their names are Caleb and Joshua. And their report is this. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses. We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. And if you read in the text, the minority report is, the land is great, the Lord will give it to us, we'll swallow them up, their protection is gone. And so they're calling and they're basically saying, we can do it. And the people's response is disastrous, because what the people respond to is the majority report. And they not only respond to it, they want to kill Joshua and Caleb, and they want to go back to Egypt. Again, this again, recurring theme over and over again. And I think the key verse here is this. They say this: why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? Here's God's response. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I'll bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But as for you, your bodies will fall in this wilderness. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness until the last of your bodies lies in the wilderness. And because of their lack of faith and obedience, that generation, every man 20 years of age and older, is going to wander in the wilderness. The whole nation is going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until every single man 20 years of age and older at the time of the spies has died. And the very thing that they've said to God, our children and our wives, they're going to get wiped out. God says, you know what? You're going to get wiped out here in the wilderness, and I'm going to make sure that your children and your wives make it in to the promised land. And so what begins at this point in time is the wilderness wandering, and this is going to go on. It's actually for 38 years, 40 more generally, the 40 years from the time that they have left Egypt. And when we watch now this period of time wandering, if you read through the chapters, you know what you're going to get? Grumbling and complaining. You think you might remember Numbers after this morning? Grumbling and complaining. And again, multiple times, Moses has to keep interceding to keep God from wiping them out. Let me hit, I was going to call them highlights. I'm going to call them, this is a map of the wander. I couldn't find a real accurate map, so this sort of gives you an idea of what goes on for the next 40 years. Okay, I was going to call it highlights of wandering, and I decided, well, actually what it is lowlights. And there's a number of things, and I won't go into detail on this. I'll just sort of hit them so you can kind of remember them, maybe go back and read these. First of all, there's another rebellion against the leadership, and this time it comes from a man by the name of Korah, and he's jealous of Aaron and Moses. He's a Levite, but he's not a priest. And the priesthood has been given to the line only of Aaron out of the tribe of Levi. And so Korah and 250 leaders of the people rebel against Moses and complain and grumble. And to make a long story short, the ground opens, swallows them up, the ground closes, and all of them die. Now, along with that, then to prove a point in terms of who God has chosen, instruction is given that each of the tribes are to bring a staff, walking stick, which, by the way, is a big piece of dead wood. This is what a walking stick was, or the rod, like Moses' rod that he struck the Nile with and the waters came part. I mean, as you're walking through the wilderness, you need your rod. And so he says, bring me one from every tribe. And from the tribe of Levi, Aaron, you put your rod here. And they lay them down in front of the tabernacle there, in front of the sanctuary. And Moses says, the rod that buds will be the one that you will know God has chosen for this calling that this rebellion has broken out against. And what happens is that in the morning, Aaron's rod has not only budded, it has blossomed, and it even is bearing fruit. I mean, it's a miracle, obviously, but it was a way that God would tangibly and miraculously demonstrate He had called Aaron to be, the priesthood, his descendants, the priesthood. And that rod then was placed, initially it was placed in front of the Ark of the Covenant, and eventually that rod went into the Ark of the Covenant, so that by the time the nation has entered into the land, inside the Ark of the Covenant there are 3 items. There are the broken the second tablets of the 10 Commandments are in there. Aaron's rod that's budded is in there, and a jar of manna is in there. And my sense is this, that what happens there is that what's placed inside that ark are tangible evidence of the people's rebellion against God. It's like they become an image of humanity's sin because they reject the leadership, they complain about it, they reject the food, they get sick of the food, they want meat, and then obviously they've broken the law, the 10 Commandments. And so it really is a cool image, and I've gone through this before, but remember then, what you have is you've got the ark there with again, what I think are symbols of humanity's sin, and you have hovering over the ark what were called the angels of the cherubim, 2 big golden angels hovering and looking down upon the Ark of the Covenant. And between these 2 angels, God was going to manifest His presence in a very real and special way. But in a sense, when you see that scenario, what you see is humanity deserving judgment. The holiness and righteousness of God looking down on the disobedience and sinfulness of humanity. And praise the Lord that He has one other piece of, they call it furniture, there in the Ark of the Covenant, and that is put a covering on top of it. And it was called the mercy seat, or the place of atonement. And that is where once a year on the Day of Atonement, the blood of the goat that's been sacrificed is brought in and sprinkled there to atone for the sins of the nation. And again, all pointing forward to what Christ was going to do. But again, it's the atoning blood sacrifice that stands between the holiness of God and the sinfulness of man. And so it's a vivid picture of this, but Aaron's rod is part of what goes into the Ark of the Covenant. Then another, again, low light here, Moses' blunder. Moses never makes it into, Moses makes it into the promised land, but he doesn't get there till the time of Jesus, because Moses appears on the Mount of Transfiguration with Elijah and Jesus, but at this point in time, Moses is not allowed to enter into the land when the nation enters in, because he himself is disobedient, and God tells him, speak. They don't have any water. The Israelites grumbling and complaining, and God says to Moses, speak to this rock and water will come out. Now, back when they left Egypt in the book of Exodus, they hit a point where they didn't have water, and God told him to strike a rock with his rod and water would come out. So he struck the rock and water came out in Exodus. Now God says, speak to the rock and water will come out. And Moses takes his rod and hits the rock. He strikes the rock instead of speaking to the rock, and he forfeits. I know this sounds very harsh, but in a sense, that's what goes on under the law. And in response to the fact that he blunders and doesn't do what God told him, he's not going to enter the promised land. And when we get to the end of next week, which is the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is going to leave the encampment. He's going to go up onto Mount Nebo, and he's going to die there on Mount Nebo. But he does make it to the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus is here. So I always like to think, well, he does make it into the land. It just takes a while. All right? So Moses' mistake. Edom resists. You can read about that. I want to kind of speed things up here for a minute. Edom resists them so that instead of kind of being able to take the direct route, as they're now heading, this is like at the end of 38 years, they're now on the final approach to the promised land, and the generation has died off. And because of Edom's resistance, they've got to go the long way around, and that's going to come back later on in the Old Testament to kind of haunt Edom. And then what I think is one of the great little incidents in the book of Numbers, chapter 21. I know you won't believe this, but they're on their way to the promised land, and the people begin to grumble and complain. What do you... And God, in this instance, does an amazing thing. He's angry, so he sends poisonous snakes into the camp. And poisonous snakes, they start biting people, and people start dying. And Moses, again, intercedes on their behalf. And God, I think, does I just think it's fascinating. Here's what he does. He says to Moses, here's what you do. Make a snake, a model of a snake, I don't know how you say it, out of bronze, stick it on a pole, and lift it up in the middle of the camp. Now, this isn't real rational. It's like, he doesn't say, go out and spray all the snakes with snake killer or something. Anyway, I don't know what he would have said. But think about this. He says, so God says this, very simple, lift up the serpent on the rod in the middle of the camp, and when someone is bit, tell them, look to the serpent or the rod, and you'll live. And if you get bit and you don't look to the serpent, you die. Now, I think that seems very kind of, in some ways, bizarre, but this is the way God chooses this, and it's like an act of faith that will have to be made to choose to look to the serpent. And this is the incident where Jesus refers to in John chapter 3, where he says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believes in him will live. And again, there's choices here. So, we live in a world where we're all snake bit, and we're all dying. And apart from Christ, we're not only dying physically, we're dying spiritually. We're separated from God. And God has a solution. He puts his Son on a cross and lifts him up. And Jesus atones for the sin of humanity on the cross, but humanity has to make a choice. And it's just like the Israelites in the wilderness. Here's God's provision for salvation, and if you will embrace Jesus and open your life to him, you will live. And if you choose not to, just like the Israelites that decided not to look to the serpent, you're going to die. And so Jesus points back to this situation. Two choices: look and live, don't and die. Look and live, don't and die. And I think, again, the application of that into how God has provided through Christ. And remember, Paul says it's foolishness to the world. We don't feel that way. But honestly, if you'd never heard any of this, and sometimes if someone would say, well, yeah, you're separated from God, you're spiritually dead, you've chosen to do things that are against what God has said you're supposed to do, so therefore you have sinned, you're accountable, and judgment is coming, okay? But God has a solution. He's going to let his Son be crucified, okay? And you need to place your faith in Jesus Christ. And frankly, to some people, that just sounds like foolishness. In the same way that for some people, the serpent must have seemed, well, that's stupid. I'm not looking at that, and they die. 24,000 people die, by the way. And finally, the nation, I don't have time to go into Balaam. read that chapter. Balaam, as they're finally getting right here, let me see, I think I got a map in here. Let me look. Okay, as they finally have made it up to the east bank of the Jordan. I know I've got a map. Okay, so kind of roughly, you can kind of see how now from Kadesh Barnea, and this is the final little stretch that they're up, and again, they've got to go around over to the east side there, and they come up right to the border of the Jordan River. There's this incident where they've been defeating kings now along the way. They've defeated the kings of not Edom, Midian, Sihon and Og. And when they get to this point, the king of Moab calls for a pagan diviner by the name of Balaam to come and curse them. And he believes, the king believes that if Balaam curses them, that they will not defeat the Midianites and the Moabites. And if you read the text, God tells Balaam, don't go. And so he says, I can't go. God won't let me. So they come back with more money, basically, and offer him, and he says, I can't go. And so they go back and they get more prestigious representatives and, more reward. They come back for a third time, and God finally says, okay, go, but only say what I tell you to say. And by the way, they're headed, they're headed to they're headed there, Balaam, and he's riding his ass, and we're told that God, he gets mad still, and that the angel of the Lord comes and is standing with a sword, and he's gonna kill Balaam, and the donkey stops dead. And so, so Balaam beats him, okay? And he gets up and he goes a little further, and the donkey sees the angel, not Balaam, all right? And Balaam beats him again. And he doesn't know what's going on. And a third time he beats him, and finally the donkey turns and starts talking to Balaam. This is where Narnia came from, talking animals. No, just kidding. Anyway, and he basically, then God is, he says, why are you, this is it's a crazy one, but there it is. And he confronts Balaam. Balaam then ends up going and 4 times pronounces blessing instead of cursing over the nation of Israel. And they're there at the Jordan. They are ready to enter. A second census is taken, and this time, total number of men, 20 years of age and older, 601,730. Everyone except Joshua and Caleb from that previous generation have died. And really right before this, but I'm going to combine them, there at the Jordan, there is a major change in leadership. Moses is not going to lead them in, and his leadership is transferred to Joshua. Aaron has died kind of on this final stretch heading to the east side of the Jordan, and his son Eleazar will now become the high priest. And so you have this leadership change, and then the last thing that happens here on the east side of the Jordan is that Moses gives his final departing speech to the Israelites, and that is what is contained in the book of Deuteronomy, and that's where we will go next week. All right? Biff, we're going to go 5 minutes over just so you guys can do the final deal, and so come on up. And why don't I do the benediction, and then you guys can... Dave,
just remind him, retiring offering.
Retiring offering for Love Inc. Don't forget that. And why don't you stand, and Dave, is it okay? You want me to benedict upon them? I'm going to benedict upon your bad self. Book of Numbers, by the way, chapter 6, didn't get into it, is where God says to the Levites, pray this over the people. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you, give you his peace. And God says, and you will place my name on them, and I will bless them. So I'm going to do that right now. You ready? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you, be gracious to you. The Lord lift up the light of His countenance upon you and give you His peace. May He bless you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.